The alarm clock screamed at 5 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 3 years. Maya rolled over in her small apartment bed, her body protesting the early hour. The summer heat was already building up, even at this ungodly time, and she knew it would be another scorching day at the diner. She sat up slowly, her left shoulder aching where the metal fragment had torn through muscle and bone years ago. The doctors had done their best, but some pain never really goes away. Maya had learned to live with it, just like she'd learned to live with everything else that came after. Walking to her tiny bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror, 28 years old, but some days she felt twice that age. Her dark skin showed the toll of too many sleepless nights and too much worry. But her eyes, those were still strong. They had to be. Maya opened her closet and pulled out her usual uniform for work: black pants and a long-sleeved white shirt. Even in the summer heat, even when the kitchen temperature would climb past 90 degrees, she always wore long sleeves. It was worth the discomfort to keep people from staring, from asking questions she didn't want to answer. The scars ran from her wrists almost to her elbows on both arms. Twisted, angry lines that told a story she wasn't ready to share with anyone. In this small town, they were reminders of a day when everything changed, when the person she used to be got buried under rubble and smoke in a place most people couldn't even pronounce. She carefully rolled up her sleeves just enough to brush her teeth and wash her face, then pulled them back down. The routine was automatic now, like putting on armor every morning. The tattoo on her shoulder was easier to hide, a simple matter of keeping her shirt on. But sometimes when she moved just right, she could feel it there under the fabric, a reminder of who she used to be. The drive to Rosie's diner took 15 minutes through the quiet streets of Millbrook. This wasn't the kind of town where she'd grown up, but it was peaceful, and peace was something she'd learned to value more than excitement. The diner sat on the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue, a classic American establishment with red vinyl booths and a black and white checkered floor that had seen better days. Maya parked her beaten-up Honda Civic in the employee lot behind the building. The car was 15 years old and made concerning noises when she started it, but it ran, and that was all that mattered. She grabbed her purse and headed for the back entrance, already preparing herself mentally for another day of smiling when she didn't feel like it. "Morning, Maya," called out Carlos the cook as she entered through the kitchen door. He was already prepping for the breakfast rush, his large frame moving with surprising grace as he organized his station. Carlos had been working at Rosie's for 12 years and knew every customer's order by heart. "Morning, Carlos." "Hot one today?" Maya replied, tying her apron around her waist. She'd grown fond of Carlos over the years. He was one of the few people who never asked personal questions, never pushed when she didn't want to talk. He just accepted her as she was, scars and secrets and all. Mrs. Rodriguez, the owner, emerged from her office with a cup of coffee already in hand. Elena Rodriguez had bought the diner from the original owner 7 years ago and had been trying to modernize it ever since. She was a kind woman in her 50s who treated her employees like family, sometimes to a fault. "Maya, good you're here. We've got a bus tour coming through around 10, so we'll need to be ready for a crowd," Mrs. Rodriguez said, checking her watch. "Are you feeling okay? You look tired." "I'm fine, Mrs. Rodriguez. Just didn't sleep well," Maya answered, which was true. Sleep had been hard to come by for longer than she cared to admit. The nightmares weren't as frequent as they used to be, but they still came around when she least expected them. The first customers started trickling in around 6:30. The early crowd was mostly locals, construction workers grabbing coffee before heading to job sites, elderly folks who'd been coming to Rosie's since before Maya was born, and a few regulars who worked the early shift at the plant outside town. Maya knew most of them by name now. There was Mr. Peterson, who always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast and complained about the weather no matter what season it was. Betty and Harold Johnson, married for 53 years, who shared a stack of pancakes every Tuesday and Thursday. Tom the mailman, who liked his coffee black and his conversation brief. These were the good customers, the ones who made the job bearable. They treated her with respect, left decent tips, and never made her feel like she was being judged. But as the morning wore on, other types of customers would start coming in, the ones who looked at her like she was something to be pitied or feared. "Hun, can I get a refill?" called out Betty from booth number 3. Maya grabbed the coffee pot and headed over, careful to keep her sleeves from riding up as she poured. "How's your brother doing with his studies?" Betty asked. Maya's face brightened at the mention of David. Her younger brother was in his 3rd year at the state university, studying engineering. He was the one bright spot in her life, the reason she got up every morning and dealt with whatever came her way. "He's doing great, actually. Made the dean's list again last semester." "I'm really proud of him," Maya said, and meant it. David was. Everything she'd hoped he could be: smart, ambitious, and somehow untouched by the darkness that had settled over her own life. "That's wonderful, dear. You should be proud." "It takes a lot of sacrifice to put someone through school these days," Betty said, patting Maya's hand gently. The older woman had no idea how right she was. Every dollar Maya earned went toward David's education or her own basic needs. She lived in a tiny apartment, drove a car that barely ran, and hadn't bought herself anything new in months. But David's tuition was paid, his books were bought, and he could focus on his studies without worrying about money. That was worth every sacrifice. As the morning rush intensified, Maya found herself moving faster, juggling multiple tables and trying to keep everyone happy. She was good at her job, efficient, friendly, and professional. But she was also constantly aware of the looks she got from certain customers. The way some people's eyes would linger on her arms even though her scars were hidden. There was something about her that people picked up on, some sense that she was different, that she didn't quite fit in this small town. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, with a posture that spoke of discipline and training. Maybe it was the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, always aware of exits and potential threats. Or maybe it was just the invisible weight she carried, the kind that comes from seeing things most people never have to see. Around 9:30, a family came in with 3 young children. The kids were loud and energetic, running around the restaurant while their parents seemed oblivious to the chaos they were creating. Maya watched them with mixed feelings. Part of her remembered being that young and carefree, but another part of her felt old beyond her years. "Excuse me, waitress," the father called out, snapping his fingers to get her attention. Maya bit back her first response and walked over with a smile. "What can I get started for you folks?" she asked, pulling out her order pad. "We need high chairs for the little ones and make sure they're clean. Also, we'll need extra napkins, and I want to make sure your cook washes his hands before he prepares our food," the man said, his tone suggesting he thought she might not be competent enough to handle such complex requests. Maya nodded and went about getting everything ready, ignoring the implied insult. She'd learned that some people just needed to feel superior to others, and service workers were easy targets. It wasn't personal, even though it felt that way sometimes. By 10 o'clock, the bus tour Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned arrived, bringing 35 senior citizens into the diner all at once. Maya and the other waitress, Jenny, scrambled to accommodate everyone, pushing tables together and trying to take orders for a group that couldn't seem to agree on anything. "This is chaos," Jenny whispered to Maya as they passed each other carrying trays of food. Jenny was 19 and still lived with her parents. She was a good kid, but she didn't understand why Maya never complained about difficult customers, or why she always volunteered to take the worst shifts. "We'll get through it," Maya replied, balancing 4 plates on her arms with practiced ease. "We always do." As the lunch rush began to die down, Maya finally had a moment to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, watching the last of the bus tour customers file out of the diner. Her feet hurt, her shoulder ached, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead from the heat and the long sleeves she refused to give up. But she'd made it through another morning, earned another day's pay, and gotten one step closer to her goal. David's graduation was still over a year away, but every shift brought them closer to that moment when she could finally say she'd kept her promise to their mother, The afternoon would bring new challenges, new customers, and new opportunities. To prove that she belonged here, that she was more than the sum of her scars and secrets. Maya straightened her apron, picked up the coffee pot, and prepared to face whatever came next. She'd survived worse than a difficult lunch rush, and she'd survive this too. Tuesday afternoon started like any other day at Rosie's diner. The lunch rush was winding down, and Maya was wiping down tables when she heard the rumble of expensive car engines outside. Through the window, she could see 3 black luxury cars pulling into the parking lot, their chrome wheels gleaming in the afternoon sun. Maya didn't think much of it at first. The highway brought all kinds of travelers through Millbrook, and sometimes wealthy folks stopped for a quick meal or coffee. But something about the way these cars were parked, taking up multiple spaces like they owned the place, made her feel uneasy. The door chimed as 5 men in expensive suits walked in. They were all middle-aged, wearing watches that probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months. Their shoes were polished to perfection, and their hair was styled in that way that screamed money and power. They looked around the diner like they'd stepped into a foreign country, their faces showing barely concealed disgust at the simple, working-class establishment. "Table for 5, announced the tallest one, a man with graying hair and cold blue eyes. He didn't ask politely or wait to be seated. He just expected service, the way people do when they're used to getting whatever they want. Maya grabbed 5 menus and led them to the large corner booth. As she set down the menus, she could hear them making comments under their breath about the quaint decorations and the authentic dive bar atmosphere. Their tone made it clear they didn't mean it as a compliment. "Can I start you gentlemen off with something to drink?" Maya asked, keeping her voice professional and friendly despite the bad vibes she was getting from the group. "Coffee, black, and make sure it's fresh," the leader said without looking up from his phone. "Also, we're in a hurry, so we'll need fast service. We've got important business to attend to." The others placed their drink orders with the same dismissive attitude. Maya headed to the coffee station where Carlos was cleaning his grill. "Those guys seem like real charmers," Carlos said quietly, shaking his head. "I've seen their type before. They think money makes them better than everyone else?" Maya nodded, filling the coffee cups. She'd served difficult customers before, but something about these men felt different. There was a meanness in their eyes that went beyond simple arrogance. When she returned with the drinks, the men were deep in conversation about some business deal. Maya set down the cups carefully, but as she placed the last one in front of the leader, her elbow accidentally knocked his phone, which was lying on the table. "Watch it!" he snapped, grabbing his phone and checking it for damage. "Do you have any idea how much this costs?" "Probably more than you make in a year." "I'm sorry, sir." "Let me get you a fresh napkin," Maya said, reaching across the table. As she did, her sleeve caught on the edge of a water glass and rode up about 2 inches, exposing just a small portion of her scarred forearm. The man's eyes immediately locked onto the visible scars, and his expression changed from annoyance to something much worse. "What the hell is that?" he said loudly, pointing at her arm. Maya quickly pulled her sleeve back down, her heart racing. "I'm sorry, let me just take your food order and—" "No. Wait a minute," the man interrupted, his voice getting louder. "I want to see what you're hiding under there." "What kind of person are we dealing with here?" The other men at the table leaned in, their conversation stopping as they focused on Maya. She could feel every eye in the diner turning toward their table, and her face began to burn with embarrassment. "Sir, I just need to know what you'd like to order," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll tell you what I'd like," the man said, standing up from his seat. "I'd like to know what kind of establishment hires people who look like they've been in gang fights. This is a restaurant, not a halfway house." Maya's hands started to shake. She'd dealt with rude customers before, but never anything like this. "Sir, please, I'm just trying to do my job." "Your job?" Another man at the table laughed. "Your job is to serve food, not make paying customers uncomfortable. Look at her, guys." "What do you think happened? Drug deal gone wrong? Prison fight?" The leader reached out suddenly and grabbed Maya's wrist before she could pull away. "Let's see what we're really dealing with here," he said, pushing her sleeve up despite her attempts to stop him. The scars were now visible to everyone in the diner. Twisted, angry lines that ran up her forearm, telling a story of pain and survival that these men couldn't begin to understand. Maya tried to pull her arm away, but the man's grip was firm. "Jesus Christ," one of the other men said, making a disgusted face. "What the hell happened to you? That's revolting. Please let go of me," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel tears starting to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people. "This is unacceptable," the leader said, still holding her wrist. "We're paying customers, and we shouldn't have to look at this while we're trying to eat. What kind of place is this?" Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from the kitchen, having heard the commotion. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, though it was clear from her tone that she could see everything was definitely not all right. "No, everything is not all right," the leader said, finally releasing Maya's wrist. "We came here for a simple meal, and instead we're being served by someone who looks like they've been through a meat grinder. This is disgusting and unprofessional." Maya rubbed her wrist where the man had grabbed her, trying to process what was happening. In 3 years of working at the diner, nothing like this had ever occurred. Sure, she'd gotten strange looks and whispered comments, but no one had ever physically grabbed her or humiliated her in public like this. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Mrs. Rodriguez said diplomatically. "Maya is one of our best employees. Perhaps we can—" "There's no misunderstanding," another man interrupted. "We don't want to be served by someone who looks like that. It's unsanitary and disturbing. Don't you have standards here?" The entire diner had gone quiet. Maya could see other customers watching the scene unfold, some looking uncomfortable, others seeming to enjoy the drama. Mr. Peterson was shaking his head sadly, and Betty Johnson looked like she wanted to say something but didn't know how to intervene. "I'm going to have to ask you gentlemen to lower your voices," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her own voice getting firmer. "This is a family establishment." "Family establishment?" The leader laughed harshly. "Families don't want to see this kind of thing. What are you going to tell the children who come in here? That it's okay to look like a freak as long as you can carry a coffee pot?" Maya felt like she was going to be sick. The word freak hit her like a physical blow, and she could feel herself starting to shut down the way she did when the memories got too overwhelming. But she was at work in public, and she couldn't just disappear. "Maybe she was in some kind of accident," suggested one of the quieter men at the table, though his tone wasn't particularly sympathetic. "Either way, it's not something we should have to deal with during our meal. Accident, fight, whatever it was, it's not our problem," the leader said. "We're important people with important business to conduct. We don't have time for this kind of distraction." Maya looked around the diner desperately, hoping someone would speak up, would tell these men to stop, would defend her somehow. But everyone just sat there, watching the spectacle like it was entertainment. She felt more alone than she had in years. "Look, we're not trying to be cruel," another man said, though his words suggested otherwise. "We're just saying that certain types of people should work in certain types of jobs. Maybe she'd be better suited for something where she doesn't have to interact with the public." "That's enough," Maya said suddenly, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm just trying to work and take care of my family. I don't deserve to be treated like this," the leader smiled coldly. "Deserve? You think you deserve to make paying customers uncomfortable? You think you deserve to work in a place where people are trying to enjoy their food? Maybe you should think about what you deserve and what you don't." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her face red with anger. "I think you gentlemen should leave." "Now, we'll leave when we're ready to leave," the leader said. "But first, I want to make sure everyone here understands what kind of establishment this really is. A place that hires people who clearly have serious problems, who make normal people uncomfortable, who probably shouldn't be handling food in the first place." Maya felt her knees getting weak. The humiliation was overwhelming, and she could feel herself starting to dissociate, to retreat into the dark place in her mind where she went when things got too painful to handle. But she was still standing there, still holding her order pad. still trying to do her job despite everything. The worst part wasn't even the cruelty of the men. It was the silence of everyone else. The way the other customers just sat there and watched her being torn apart without saying a word. It made her feel like maybe these men were right. Maybe she really was something to be ashamed of, something that didn't belong in normal society. "I'm calling the police," Mrs. Rodriguez said, reaching for her phone. "Go ahead," the leader said. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just exercising our right as customers to voice our concerns about the service we're receiving." Maya closed her eyes and tried to find the strength to keep standing. In the corner booth where he'd been sitting for the past hour, James slowly set down his coffee cup. The ceramic made a soft click against the table, but the sound seemed loud in the tense atmosphere of the diner. For weeks now he'd been coming to Rosie's almost every day, always choosing the same corner seat where he could see the entire restaurant while keeping his back to the wall. James was 35 years old, though some days he felt much older. His dark hair was cut short in the military style he'd never quite abandoned, and his brown eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much of the world's ugliness. He'd been back from his third deployment for 6 months now, but adjusting to civilian life felt harder each time. The diner had become his refuge, a place where he could sit quietly and try to remember what normal felt like. The waitress with the long sleeves had always been kind to him, never pushing conversation when he clearly wasn't in the mood to talk. She'd refill his coffee without being asked and never made him feel like he was taking up space by sitting alone for hours. Now, as he watched the businessmen humiliate her, something dark and angry was building in his chest. He'd seen bullies before in school, in the military, in bars around the world. But watching grown men gang up on a woman who was just trying to do her job made his blood boil in a way he hadn't felt in months. James had been struggling with his own demons since coming home. The transition from military life to civilian existence was never easy, but this time felt different. He'd lost too many friends, seen too many things that couldn't be unseen. The nightmares came regularly, and some days he felt like he was barely holding himself together. But watching this scene unfold, seeing the way the woman's hands shook as she tried to pull her sleeve back down, James felt something click into place. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about standing up for someone who needed help, something he'd been trained to do his entire adult life. He studied the waitress more carefully as the confrontation continued. There was something about the way she carried herself, even under stress, that seemed familiar. Her posture was straight despite the obvious fear, and she maintained eye contact with her attackers even when her voice shook. It was the bearing of someone who'd been trained to face adversity, to stand firm under pressure. When the lead businessman grabbed her wrist and forced her sleeve up, James felt his jaw clench. The man's actions were aggressive and inappropriate, the kind of behavior that would get someone thrown out of any decent establishment. But what really caught James's attention was the brief glimpse of the woman's arm. When her sleeve was pushed up, the scars were immediately recognizable to him. Not the specific pattern, but the type of injury they represented. He'd seen similar wounds on dozens of soldiers over the years, the kind of damage that came from explosive devices and flying shrapnel. These weren't the random scars of an accident or fight. They were the organized chaos of a blast pattern, the signature of an IED or mortar round. James leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look without being obvious. As the businessman continued to hold the woman's wrist, her sleeve rode up a bit more, and that's when James saw it. Just barely visible beneath the fabric was the edge of a tattoo, and what he could see made his heart skip a beat. The partial outline of an eagle, the curve of what looked like a globe, and underneath, the beginning of text that he recognized instantly. It was a Marine Corps unit tattoo, and not just any unit. The specific design, the font of the lettering, the placement on the arm, it was all familiar because he had the exact same tattoo on his own shoulder. James sat back in his booth, his mind racing. The woman being humiliated across the diner wasn't just a random civilian. She was a Marine, and based on the tattoo design, she'd served in the same unit he had. The same unit that had spent 18 months in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. Suddenly, The scars on her arms told a completely different story. They weren't something to be ashamed of or hidden. They were evidence of service, of sacrifice, of someone who'd put herself in harm's way for her country. The irony of the situation hit him like a physical blow. Civilians mocking a veteran who'd been wounded defending their freedom. James tried to remember faces from his deployments, but there had been so many people rotating in and out of the unit. Combat zones were chaotic, and personnel moved around constantly. But something about this woman tugged at his memory. Like a song he'd heard before but couldn't quite place. He watched as Mrs. Rodriguez tried to intervene, as the businessmen continued their verbal assault, as other customers in the diner sat silent and uncomfortable. The woman, the Marine, was holding herself together with visible effort, but James could see the cracks starting to show. He recognized the signs of someone fighting to maintain control when everything inside them was falling apart. James had been in similar situations himself, moments when civilian life suddenly felt alien and hostile, when the gap between military service and regular society seemed impossible to bridge. He'd stood in grocery stores feeling overwhelmed by the number of cereal choices, had walked out of movies because the sound effects triggered flashbacks, had struggled to relate to people who complained about problems that seemed trivial compared to what he'd seen overseas, but this was different. This woman wasn't just struggling with the normal challenges of readjusting to civilian life. She was being actively attacked, humiliated for the very injuries she'd sustained in service to her country. The men tormenting her had no idea what they were doing, no understanding of what those scars represented. James felt his protective instincts kicking in, the same ones that had kept him and his fellow Marines alive through 3 deployments. In combat, you didn't abandon your teammates. You didn't let them face the enemy alone. And right now, this woman was facing enemies who were attacking her with words instead of weapons, but the damage they were doing was just as real. The businessman was still holding her wrist, still making cruel comments about her appearance. Other customers were starting to look away, uncomfortable with the scene but unwilling to get involved. Mrs. Rodriguez was threatening to call the police, but James knew that by the time they arrived, the damage would be done. The woman would be left with the memory of being humiliated in front of a room full of people who did nothing to help her. James looked down at his own arms, at the scars that he usually kept hidden under long sleeves. His wounds were different from hers, but they came from the same place, the same willingness to serve despite the risks. He'd been sitting in this corner booth for months, trying to find his purpose in civilian life, trying to figure out how to move forward. Now, watching a fellow Marine under attack, he realized that some purposes were clearer than others. Some moments demanded action, regardless of personal comfort or convenience. This was one of those moments. James stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound was quiet, but in the tense atmosphere of the diner it seemed to echo. He was a big man, 6 feet tall and built like someone who'd spent years in physical training. When he moved, people tended to notice. As he walked toward the businessmen's table, James felt something shift inside him. The fog of depression and uncertainty that had been clouding his mind for months suddenly cleared. He knew exactly what he needed to do, and for the first time in a long while, he felt completely sure of himself. The other customers in the diner sensed the change in atmosphere. Conversations stopped, and people turned to watch as James approached the scene. There was something about his bearing, his confident stride, that suggested he wasn't just another concerned customer. This was someone who'd been trained to handle confrontation, someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. The businessmen were so focused on their victim that they didn't notice him at first. They were still making cruel comments, still treating the woman like she was less than human. But James was close enough now to see the tattoo more clearly, to confirm what he'd suspected from across the room. It was definitely a Marine Corps unit tattoo, and it was definitely the same unit he'd served with. The woman being humiliated was his sister in arms, someone who'd taken the same oath he had, someone who'd faced the same dangers and made the same sacrifices. James stopped right behind the lead businessman, close enough that his shadow fell across the table. The man was still holding the woman's wrist, still making disgusted comments about her scars. But James could see something else now, something that made his blood run cold with anger. The way the woman was standing, the look in her eyes, the careful control she was maintaining despite the obvious distress, it all clicked into place. He remembered her now, remembered the day everything went wrong, remembered the explosion that changed so many lives. James cleared his throat, and the businessman finally looked up, annoyed at being interrupted. But when he saw James standing there, something in the Marine's expression made him pause. There was a coldness in James's eyes that spoke of someone who'd seen real violence, real consequences, real enemies. "I think," James said, in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority, "you gentlemen need to let go of that Marine and find somewhere else to eat." The businessman blinked, confused. "Marine, what are you talking about?" The moment James rolled up his sleeve, the entire atmosphere in the diner changed. The tattoo on his forearm was identical to the one barely visible on Maya's arm, the same eagle, globe, and anchor, the same unit designation underneath, but more than that. The scars surrounding his tattoo told their own story of service and sacrifice. The businessman who had been gripping Maya's wrist suddenly found himself looking up at 6 feet of trained Marine who clearly wasn't backing down. James's posture was relaxed but ready, the stance of someone who'd faced much more dangerous opponents than a group of entitled businessmen. "You're lying," the businessman said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Anyone can get a tattoo. That doesn't prove anything." James stepped closer, and his voice took on the tone he'd used to address subordinates in combat zones. "2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. We served together in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. That tattoo isn't something you get at a shop downtown. It's earned through 18 months of hell in one of the most dangerous places on Earth." Maya's eyes widened as she stared at James. The memories were coming back now, triggered by his presence and his words. She remembered that voice, remembered seeing his face in the chaos of those final days before her world exploded into pain and darkness. "I remember you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the tension in the room. "You were there when ... when the IED went off on Patrol 7, James finished for her. "October 5th, 10th, 3 years ago. I helped carry you to the medevac helicopter." The lead businessman finally released Maya's wrist, but his arrogance hadn't completely disappeared. "So what if you both served? That doesn't give you the right to interrupt paying customers. We're just trying to have a meal without having to look at ... that." James turned his full attention to the man, and there was something in his expression that made several of the other businessmen shift uncomfortably in their seats. "That?" James repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You mean the scars she got when she threw herself on top of a wounded soldier to shield him from a second explosion? The injuries she sustained while saving someone else's life?" Maya felt tears starting to form in her eyes as the memories flooded back. She remembered that day with painful clarity now, the sound of the first blast, the screaming, the sight of Rodriguez lying motionless in the dirt. She remembered making the split-second decision to cover him with her own body when she heard the whistle of incoming mortar. "Rodriguez," she said suddenly, looking at James. "Private Rodriguez from Texas, is he—" "He's alive," James said, his voice gentler now as he addressed her. "He made it home to his family because of what you did. He's got 2 kids now, and he tells everyone about the Marine who saved his life." The businessman was starting to look uncomfortable as other customers in the diner began to pay closer attention to the conversation. Mr. Peterson had gotten up from his booth and was walking over, his weathered face set in lines of anger. "Now, you listen here," Mr. Peterson said, pointing a gnarled finger at the businessman. "I've been coming to this diner for 20 years, and Maya's one of the finest people I've ever met. If she's a war hero on top of that, then you boys should be ashamed of yourselves." Betty Johnson had also stood up, her small frame trembling with indignation. "That young woman has been serving us with kindness and respect for 3 years. She's putting her brother through college and never complains about anything. How dare you treat her like that?" James continued his confrontation with the businessman, but his words were now directed at the entire table. While you were sitting in your comfortable offices, making your deals and counting your money, she was serving our country in one of the most dangerous places on earth. Those scars you find so disgusting, they're proof of courage, proof of sacrifice. Look, we didn't know, one of the other businessmen said, clearly wanting to defuse the situation. Maybe we got a little carried away? James's voice rose slightly. You physically grabbed her, humiliated her in public, and treated her like she was less than human. That's not getting carried away. That's being cruel to someone who deserves your respect. Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process everything that was happening. For 3 years, she'd hidden her service, her injuries, her past. She'd convinced herself that it was easier to start over, to be just another waitress in a small town. But hearing James defend her, hearing the other customers speak up, made her realize how much she'd been carrying alone. I don't understand, said another businessman. If she's really a war hero, why is she working as a waitress? Why didn't she tell anyone? James looked at Maya, giving her the choice of whether to answer or let him speak for her. She took a deep breath and found her voice. Because some of us don't come home and get parades, she said quietly. Some of us come home broken, with medical bills and nightmares and injuries that don't heal right. Some of us come home to find out that the civilian world doesn't have much use for the skills we learned in combat. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Maya, honey, why didn't you ever tell me? I had no idea. Because I didn't want people to look at me differently, Maya replied. I didn't want pity or special treatment. I just wanted to work and take care of my brother and try to build a normal life. James rolled his sleeve back down, but the impact of his revelation still hung in the air. The problem is that normal life doesn't always make room for people. Like us, we come back from serving our country, and sometimes we have to fight just as hard to find our place at home. The lead businessman was looking increasingly uncomfortable as more customers gathered around. Carlos had come out of the kitchen, his large frame and stern expression adding to the intimidating circle forming around their table. We should probably go, one of the businessmen murmured to his companions. Yeah, you should, said Carlos, crossing his arms. And you should think real hard about how you treat people, especially people who've sacrificed more than you'll ever know. But James wasn't finished. He pulled out his wallet and removed a faded photograph, a group picture of Marines in combat gear, taken somewhere in the Afghan desert. He set it on the table in front of the businessmen. You see this picture? This is our unit, taken about a month before the attack that wounded her. Half the people in this photo didn't make it home. The ones who did carry the weight of that every single day. Maya looked at the photograph and immediately spotted herself, younger and stronger, standing next to Rodriguez and 3 other Marines who hadn't survived the deployment. The sight of their faces brought a fresh wave of emotion. Turner Phillips. And Kowalski, she said, pointing to 3 faces in the photo. They died 2 weeks after this was taken. Roadside bomb on the way back from a humanitarian mission. The businessmen were now completely silent, the fight gone out of them as they began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. But James pressed on, his voice filled with controlled anger. Every time someone like you treats a veteran like garbage, every time you make assumptions about our scars or our struggles, you dishonor the memory of the people who didn't come home. You spit on the sacrifice of families who lost sons and daughters so you could sit safely in your offices and make your money. We're sorry, the lead businessman said finally, his voice much quieter than before. We really didn't know. Sorry isn't enough, said Mr. Peterson. You hurt a good person who's been through more than you can imagine. James looked around the diner at all the faces watching the confrontation. This is what I want you to understand, he said, addressing not just the businessmen, but everyone present. Veterans are everywhere. The person serving your coffee, bagging your groceries, fixing your car, they might be someone who served their country with honor. They might be dealing with injuries you can't see, fighting battles you don't understand. Maya felt something shifting inside her as she listened to James speak. For 3 years, she'd been hiding, ashamed of her scars and her struggles. But standing here, listening to a fellow Marine defend her service, she felt a pride she'd forgotten she possessed. "I was proud to serve with her," James continued, looking directly at Maya, "and I'm proud to know her now. Anyone who has a problem with her scars, her service, or her sacrifice can take it up with me." The businessman reached into his wallet and pulled out several $100 bills, placing them on the table. "We'll pay for our drinks and leave. This should more than cover it." "We don't want your money," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "We want you to leave and think about what kind of people you want to be." As the businessmen gathered their things and headed for the door, the atmosphere in the diner was electric with emotion. Other customers were approaching Maya, offering words of support and thanks. Some were crying, moved by the revelation of her service and sacrifice. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Betty Johnson asked, taking Maya's hands in her own. "We would have been proud to know we were being served by a hero." Maya looked around at all the kind faces surrounding her, then at James, who was still standing protectively nearby. "I guess I forgot that some people might see it that way," she said softly. James smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Well, now you remember, and I hope you'll never forget again." The sound of the door chiming as the businessmen left felt like a weight lifting from the entire diner. For a moment, everyone stood in silence, processing what had just happened. Maya felt like she was seeing the world through different eyes, as if a fog she hadn't even realized was there had suddenly cleared. James was still standing beside her, and she could see her own reflection in his eyes, not the broken, damaged person she'd believed herself to be, but someone who had served with honor. It was a perspective she'd lost somewhere between the explosion in Afghanistan and the long, painful recovery that followed. "I can't believe this is real," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For 3 years, I've been hiding from who I used to be. I convinced myself that nobody would understand, that my service didn't matter anymore." Mrs. Rodriguez put her arm around Maya's shoulders, tears still flowing down her cheeks. "Honey, why didn't you trust us enough to tell us? We've been like family here. We would have supported you." Maya looked around at the faces of the customers who had become her daily routine. Mr. Peterson with his weathered hands and kind eyes, Betty and Harold Johnson, who always shared their pancakes, Carlos standing in the kitchen doorway with his apron still on. These people had been part of her life for 3 years, but she'd never really let them know her. "I was scared," Maya admitted. "I was scared that if people knew about my past, they'd either treat me like I was broken or expect me to be some kind of hero. I just wanted to be normal, you know? I wanted to disappear into a regular life." James nodded, understanding written across his face. "I get it. Coming home is harder than deployment sometimes. At least in combat, you know who the enemy is. Back here, everything feels complicated." Betty Johnson shuffled over with her walker, her face determined despite her 80-year-old frame. "Young lady, there's nothing normal about sacrificing yourself for others. There's nothing ordinary about serving your country. And there's certainly nothing wrong with carrying the marks of that service." Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, his voice gruff with emotion. "I served in Vietnam, and I've been watching you work here for 3 years. I always knew there was something special about you, the way you carried yourself, the way you treated everyone with respect even when they didn't deserve it." Maya felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. "Mr. Peterson, I had no idea you were a veteran too." That's the thing about us," he said with a sad smile. "We're everywhere, but we don't always recognize each other. Maybe it's time we started." Carlos wiped his hands on his apron and approached the group. "Maya, you know what? I'm proud to work with you. I'm proud to call you my friend. And I think everyone in this town should know what kind of person you really are." "I don't need everyone to know," Maya said quickly. "I don't want to be treated differently." James stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "But maybe you deserve to be treated differently. Maybe you deserve to be treated with the respect and honor you've earned. There's a difference between wanting pity and accepting recognition for your service." Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed Maya's hand. You know what I think? I think we should put up a photo wall, honoring all the veterans who work here or visit regularly. Starting with you and Mr. Peterson. And James, Maya added, looking at the man who had changed everything with his courage to speak up. He should be on that wall too. The afternoon crowd had been listening to the entire exchange, and now an elderly woman from the back booth spoke up. My grandson is deployed right now, somewhere overseas. When I see you, I'll think of him and I'll remember that there are people like you looking out for him. Maya felt tears starting again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she'd shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of acceptance, of finally letting go of the shame she'd been carrying for so long. There's something else, James said, pulling out his phone. There's a veteran support group that meets every Thursday night at the community center. It's just a bunch of us who get together to talk, to remember that we're not alone in this. You should come, Maya hesitated. I don't know if I'm ready for that. I've been keeping to myself for so long. That's exactly why you should come, James said with a smile. We're all figuring this out together. Some of us are dealing with visible injuries, some with invisible ones. But we understand each other in ways that civilians can't. Harold Johnson, who had been quietly listening from his booth, slowly stood up. You know, my son served 2 tours in Iraq. He came home different, struggled for years to find his place. It took him a long time to accept help, to accept that asking for support wasn't weakness. What happened to him? Maya asked. He's doing good now. He's a counselor helping other veterans. He always says that the day he stopped hiding from his service was the day his real healing began. Maya looked down at her arms, still covered by the long sleeves she'd worn every day for 3 years. Slowly, deliberately, she rolled up her sleeves, exposing the scars to everyone in the diner. The twisted lines and marked skin told a story of pain and survival, but for the first time, she saw them as James had described them, as proof of courage and sacrifice. They don't hurt anymore, she said, running her fingers over the scars. Not physically, anyway. But I've been hiding them like they were something shameful. They're not shameful, said a young woman from a table near the window. They're beautiful, in their own way. They show that you survived something terrible and kept going. Mrs. Rodriguez had an idea brewing. Maya could see it in her eyes. You know what we're going to do? We're going to have a Veterans Appreciation Day here at the diner. Free meals. For anyone who served, and we'll invite the whole community to come and show their support. Mrs. Rodriguez, you don't have to do that, Maya protested. Yes, I do. This is my restaurant, and I want it to be a place where heroes are honored, not hidden. She looked around at the gathered crowd, and I want everyone to know that they're being served by people who deserve their respect and gratitude. James's phone buzzed, and he looked at it with surprise. It's Rodriguez, he said to Maya, the soldier you saved. He lives about 2 hours from here now. I've been keeping in touch with him, and I just sent him a message about running into you. Maya's eyes widened. Rodriguez, really? What does he say? James read from his phone. He says, tell her I think about her every day. Tell her my kids know her name. Tell her she's the reason I got to watch them take their first steps. The emotion in the diner was overwhelming now. Even Carlos was wiping his eyes with his apron. Maya felt something inside her chest that she hadn't felt in years, pride. Not arrogance or superiority, but the quiet pride of knowing that her life had mattered, that her sacrifice had meant something. He wants to drive down this weekend to see you, James continued. His wife wants to meet you too. She says you're a hero to their whole family. Maya sat down heavily in the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions. I don't feel like a hero. I just did what anyone would have done. No, Mr. Peterson said firmly. You did what a Marine would have done. What a hero would have done. There's a difference. Mrs. Rodriguez clapped her hands together. Okay, it's settled. This Saturday, we're having our first Veterans Appreciation Day. Maya, I want you to invite Rodriguez and his family. James, you bring anyone from your support group who wants to come. We'll make this a celebration. I don't know what to say, Maya said, looking around at all the faces surrounding her. 3 hours ago, I felt more alone than I have in years. Now you remember that you're part of something bigger, James finished. You're part of a brotherhood and sisterhood that doesn't end when you take off the uniform. You're part of a community that values service and sacrifice. Betty Johnson tottered over and patted Maya's hand. Honey, we've been your community all along. We just didn't know how to show it properly. As the afternoon wore on, more customers came and went, but word was already spreading through the small town. People who had never really noticed Maya before were stopping by to shake her hand, to thank her for her service, to tell her stories about their own family members who had served. Maya worked the rest of her shift, but everything felt different. She moved with her head held high, no longer trying to hide her scars or minimize her presence. When new customers asked about the commotion, regular customers proudly told them about their waitress who was a war hero. As closing time approached, James was still there, nursing his coffee and clearly not wanting to leave. You know, he said to Maya as she wiped down tables, I've been coming here for months, trying to figure out how to connect with civilian life again. Today, watching you find your courage, I think I found mine too. What do you mean? Maya asked. I mean, I've been hiding too, in my own way. I've been coming here every day, sitting alone, keeping everyone at arm's length. But seeing you step into who you really are, seeing this community embrace you, it makes me think I've been doing this all wrong. Mrs. Rodriguez overheard their conversation. James, you're welcome here any time. And Maya, starting Monday, you're getting a raise? Anyone who served our country the way you have deserves better than minimum wage. As Maya untied her apron at the end of her shift, she caught her reflection in the coffee machine's polished surface.